Abbas has agreed to talk to us about her book on Islamic thought and higher education in Indonesia and its entanglements with Western universities. The book just came out this summer and is a real pleasure to read. And I think it's very fitting that we're discussing it here on Zoom, coming from these different time zones, because the book shows the mobility of scholars and the many ways in which the lines between insiders and outsiders were blurred. And so I feel like discussing it on Zoom across these different time zones is only the next logical step. And it's also only logical that we're recording this and making it available to those Indonesians for whom it's too late and who can't join us even though they registered. Dr. Megan Abbas is currently an assistant professor of religion at Colgate University and holds a PhD from Princeton University. Her methods are mostly historical. We just discussed archives, but she also conducted several interviews and conversations that inform the book. She'll speak for about 25 minutes before we will open the floor for questions and comments. Just a small note on housekeeping. You can use the chat function, of course, either the private one addressing me or the public one to send me questions during the talk, and then we will ask Professor Abbas to address them afterwards. If you'd like to use the microphone instead, just indicate that by raising your hand later during the Q&A. Thanks again for joining, and I'll hand over to you now, Dr. Megan Abbas. The screen and our ears are all yours.
Great. Thank you very much. And thanks for Saskia for inviting me and Leona for helping with all the logistics. Let me just get my PowerPoint up. And greetings to everyone who is on the recorded session. And thank you for all who are attending in person, or well, not in person, but live. That's the right way of putting that. So this project began with a puzzle. When I started my graduate training at Princeton about 10 years ago, my advisors and fellow graduate students were often interested in Indonesian Muslim connections to Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Pakistan, the regular players. They would ask, how did Indonesian Muslim intellectuals fit into the broader Islamic world? This is indeed an important question, but as I began reading the works and studying the lives of major Islamic thinkers from 20th century Indonesia, I saw hints of another transnational network that few seem to be taking all that seriously. I noticed that many State Islamic University faculty members and Ministry of Religious Affairs bureaucrats had links to McGill University in Montreal, of all places. I realized that 3 out of 4 of the most recent chairmen of Muhammadiyah have doctoral degrees in a field of either politics or Islamic studies from American universities. Intrigued by these connections to Western universities, I set out to tell the story of this alternative transnational network and its impact on not only Indonesian Islam, but the academic field of Islamic studies as well. Overall, my book repositions the Western University as a significant site for the production of Islamic knowledge and Muslim religious authority over the course of the last century. So let me unpack that sentence for a moment. We typically associate Islamic knowledge and Muslim religious authority with madrasas, pasantrans, or other explicitly Islamic schools. I, of course, don't deny that madrasa networks like Deoband in South Asia or traditional Islamic universities like Al-Azhar in Egypt remain important and vibrant intellectual institutions where Muslims learn to embody and shape their religious tradition. However, I do argue that they no longer exist as the only or even primary spaces where aspiring Muslim scholars study Islam. For more than 50 years, many prominent Muslim scholars from Indonesia and beyond have decided to pursue Islamic higher education in Western universities. Why travel to the West to study Islam? I suggest that studying Islam in Western universities provides Muslim intellectuals with the resources and opportunities to experiment with what I call cross-discursive forms of knowledge. For example, they adopt historical research methods so that they can re-examine Islam's formative period in search of new insights into the faith. They learn about competing hermeneutical theories and devise new ways of interpreting the Quran. They study the social sciences in order to better infuse Islamic values into the policymaking process. By merging empirical and normative research, these Muslim intellectuals open up new possibilities for revitalizing Islam in the modern world. However, they also transgress established discursive boundaries and unsettle existing power structures in both the Islamic and Western traditions. The resulting controversies bring a series of fundamental questions to the fore. What exactly constitutes academic versus Islamic knowledge? Are they, and should they be, distinct intellectual traditions? Which types of scholars belong in which institutional spaces? And who has the power to make such decisions, and with what consequences do they do so? At its heart, my book tells the story of the contested border between Western academia and modern Islamic thought, especially in Indonesia. While never absolute nor impenetrable, the border has long been taken for granted. It has existed to separate Muslim intellectual insiders and the Western academic outsiders who study them into two distinct and even rival traditions of inquiry. Yet by the late 20th century, the border proved to be so porous that it threatened to collapse altogether. Not only were Muslims studying Islam in Western universities, but Western academics were also teaching at Western universities and consulting for Muslim governments. Given its increasingly precarious nature, the border has become a hotbed of activism and controversy. Some have worked to hasten its erasure, and others, fearing an invasion, have endeavored to erect a higher wall and marshal new resources to police it. These movements coexist and often feed off of one another in complicated ways. Ultimately, the collapsing border reveals, as I argue, the possibilities as well as the perils of building a more integrated intellectual world, as we are all on Zoom. So what I want to do is, with that introduction, walk you through two of my favorite case studies from the book in quick order, and then draw some kind of larger conclusions about them. So the first, I'll begin with Muhammad Natsir. I probably don't need to introduce Muhammad Natsir to this audience, but of course, one of the most important Islamic intellectuals and politicians of 20th century Indonesia. But what I really want to focus on today is some of his earlier writings before Indonesian independence in the mid-1930s. So in the mid-1930s, Natsir is running a series of mixed Western Islamic schools in West Java. He is also writing prolifically. Of course, he has the series of essays and back and forth with Sukarno during this period. And he's also contributing to some of the emerging, quite popular Indonesian Islamic magazines. And in those magazines, in particular, in 1936 through 1938, he writes a series of essays that are called Islam dan Kebudayaan, or Islam and Civilization or Culture, however you would like to translate the second word, that make essentially the following argument. He's writing, of course, to a predominantly Western-trained and literate Indonesian audience in Bahasa, and he's appealing to his young readers that instead of lionizing Western intellectuals, instead of really kind of following the intellectual trends from Europe, from the Netherlands, from the United States and Britain, what Indonesians should be doing is looking back at the intellectual richness of the Islamic tradition itself. So he writes an introductory essay making this argument, and then he writes a series of pieces on individual medieval Islamic thinkers and what they have to offer modern Muslims. So he writes about Ibn Khaldun and his ideas about sociology. He writes about Islamic psychology and how it bests Freud during these periods, and writes about Ibn Sina and the kind of great, philosophical and medical discoveries that Ibn Sina made, and makes appeal, don't go to the West, instead go to these great Islamic thinkers. But I want to kind of, with that context of what these essays are arguing, look at the very opening lines of the introductory essay in this series. So here it is. He quotes H.A.R. Gibb, a British Orientalist at the time, and then explains the quote. So he writes, "Islam is indeed much more than a system of theology. It is a complete civilization." That's the direct quote from Gibb. Then he writes, "Those are the words of recognition from the great scholar of history, H.A.R. Gibb, in his well-known book, Whither Islam. This is an acknowledgement from an individual uninfluenced by feelings of religious fanaticism, free of zealotry. It is open-minded and based on frank, careful, and thorough investigation." So I want to just really highlight three things from this quote as exemplary of some of the intermingling, the interconnectedness between Western academic thinking and modern Islamic thinking in the 1930s and 40s. So first, I want to just highlight the early and prominence of Western academics in modern Islamic thought in Indonesia. So this is an essay, of course, I have the date up there from 1936. So we're not just talking about the 1990s, the 2000s, but we see this kind of prominence of Western academic scholars, Orientalists, if you want to call them, even in the pre-independence period. So second, I want to think about what Natsir is saying and how he's characterizing Gibb in his follow-up to this quote. So he writes that Gibb is uninfluenced by feelings of religious fanaticism. He's free of zealotry. He's open-minded, etc. And in a lot of ways, even though he's not using the word explicitly, he's really kind of giving Gibb a sense of objectivity in this quote. That Gibb is not, a Muslim partisan. He is not, someone involved in local debates at all. And therefore, he has this sense of objective distance, and he has this authority that comes with it. So we can see this kind of creeping in into a pamphlet, a magazine article written for fellow Muslims in Bahasa, this kind of recognition of the value of the academic outsider's authority here, the way that he frames Gibb. And then third, I want to kind of build on that point and think about how interesting this is in the context of Natsir's overall argument. So as I just mentioned a couple minutes ago, Natsir's entire series is devoted to arguing that Indonesian Muslims should not look to the West, but they should actually look to Islamic thinkers for their intellectual inspiration. Look back into the Islamic tradition, look back to the kind of medieval greats from the Middle East and from Iran predominantly. However, he decides to open that series of essays with a quote from a British Orientalist. So we might say, well, this seems slightly hypocritical. It might seem slightly ironic, but I want to think that beyond just kind of seeing the inconsistency here, I think it really shows us the extent to which even a Muslim intellectual in the 1930s who wanted to distance himself from the Western intellectual tradition, wanted to distance other Indonesian Muslims from it, and instead return to the Islamic tradition, felt compelled to engage with a Western Orientalist definition of what Islam was. That he felt compelled to quote a Western Orientalist at the very beginning to persuade his fellow Muslims that what he himself, Natsir, was saying about Islam was credible. So I think that this is really interesting that even the individuals who feel like Natsir in this period, that they really don't necessarily want to spend a lot of time engaging in the Western intellectual tradition, feel compelled that they have to, that it's unavoidable. So I have much more to say about Natsir, but I want to leave this there and just end with the first case by noting that Natsir, although to some degree, obviously his prominence makes him a special case in the 1930s, 40s, 50s, his citation practices, I argue, are pretty consistent with his contemporaries. If you flip through any of the major Islamic magazines from the 1930s, 40s, 50s, 60s, you'll see scattered and consistent footnotes, references to Western academics who are studying Islam, whether there be Dutch Orientalists like Snook, Gronja is all over the citations, or emerging British and West American references as well. So in this practice, I don't really think that Natsir is particularly unique, especially among the Masumi circles that he was floating in. Okay. So that's the first short case. Second, a little bit longer one, is about McGill. This is my favorite part of the book by far. So I spend a lot of time talking about the McGill Institute of Islamic Studies. So let me just give you some statistics first before I dive into some of the history of the McGill Institute. So the McGill Institute of Islamic Studies, one small department at McGill. It's housed in one very fancy, very nice building on McGill's campus, has produced over 200 Indonesian graduates. with master's degrees or PhDs since its inception in the 1950s, although most of those graduates have been in the 1970s and beyond, and has conducted short-term training sessions for at least 1,400, according to McGill's own statistics, Indonesian lecturers, bureaucrats, intellectuals, mostly through the State Islamic Institute system. McGill alumni include, of course, a Minister of Religious Affairs, Mukti Ali, some university rectors, who I'll be talking about briefly, Harun Nasution, and some major public intellectuals as well. So when we think that this is just one department at McGill, has produced over 200 Indonesian graduate students. So how is that the case? I became really interested in this. How does McGill, not a place that you necessarily think are going to be attracting, maybe you would think Leiden might attract a lot of Indonesians, especially in the 1950s, but it's actually this place in Canada with like amazingly ridiculous amounts of snow in the winter, becomes a center for Islamic thought among Indonesians. And the history goes back to this man up on the screen, a really well-known scholar of religion. He begins his career as a scholar of Islam, especially in South Asia, India, and Pakistan, but then moves to Harvard Divinity School later on and becomes a well-known scholar of religion more generally, named Wilfred Cantwell Smith. So Smith, Canadian himself, founded the McGill Institute in 1951, and he had a really particular vision for the demographics of the McGill Institute. He wanted what he thought of as a 50-50 split between Western academics who are becoming scholars of Islam and then practicing Muslim scholars of Islam, 50-50 among both the graduate students and ideally the faculty as well for Smith. And he had very particular visions for each half of his demographic breakdown. So for the Western faculty and Western students, Smith argued that social scientific objectivity could only get academic scholars so far in understanding Islam. That sure, the emerging kind of disciplines at the time, the kind of quantitative studies of new nations were helpful, but they didn't really help Western scholars understand what it felt like to be a Muslim, the kind of ways that Muslims thought, practiced their faith, saw the world. And as a result, Smith argued that Western scholars absolutely had to train alongside practicing Muslims in order to practice the type of intellectual empathy that he thought was crucial for cultivating a real, genuine understanding of modern Islam. So he thought for the Western students, having Muslim teachers, having Muslim colleagues in the classroom would be a real benefit for pushing them intellectually beyond their own worldview and cultivating that sense of intellectual empathy. So if that's his aim for the Western half of this demographic, he also had a particular aim for the other half of the demographic, the Muslim scholars that he was recruiting from across the Islamic world, but particularly from South Asia, Iran, and Indonesia. He, for them, thought that it would be really beneficial for scholars to travel outside of their home countries, come together in Montreal, learn academic methods, and gather what he thought of as a really productive intellectual distance from the politics and religious debates within their own native countries. And that would give them a sense of kind of intellectual distance, a way to reflect, diagnose problems that maybe they wouldn't see otherwise because they were so deeply entrenched in that context, and then develop solutions that maybe they otherwise would not have thought about either. So for Smith, he thought that this would be in some ways kind of a think tank for Muslim scholars from across the Islamic world. And in 1951, right when he's founding this institute, he is writing this letter to Cyril James, who was then the president of McGill University. And he has one of my favorite lines that he writes. I think he's a very interesting writer in general. And he wrote to the principal of McGill, justifying the establishment of this institute. At its highest, if you will not smile at the exaggerated ambition, I would foresee our program conceivably acting as a kind of midwife for the Islamic Reformation, which is struggling to be born. So here, I want to just emphasize that Smith himself is saying, look, we're not just going to be studying movements to reform Islam at the McGill Institute. We are going to be giving birth to that Islamic reform movement. And to some extent, Smith was right. A lot of major Islamic thinkers from the 20th century passed through the gates of McGill, not just Indonesians, but also Malaysians, also American scholars, etc., Pakistani scholars, etc. Okay, so I want to now think about one particular Indonesian alumnus of the McGill Institute, Harun Nasution. So Harun Nasution was born in West Sumatra, attended a Dutch Western style school in his youth, but his parents then transferred him to a modernized Islamic high school for his later education. They then encouraged him to travel to Mecca to continue his Islamic education in the 1930s. But according to Harun Nasution in his memoirs, he was rather disappointed with the Mecca that he found of the 1930s. He describes it as dusty, devoid of cars on the streets. He talks about how there are no blackboards, no desks in the classroom. That he really kind of finds Mecca to be not particularly modern and not particularly pleasing to the type of education that he was seeking. As a result of that disappointment, he writes back to Indonesia, well, not quite Indonesia at the time, but what would become Indonesia, of course, shortly, and asks his parents, can he move to Cairo, which he has heard is a much more modern, thriving, exciting place to be intellectually. Eventually, his parents give him permission, give him the funding, of course, that he needs to move on to Cairo. He enrolls in Al-Azhar temporarily. But still is, at least according to his memoirs post facto, is not particularly satisfied with the education that he is finding at Al-Azhar. He talks about feeling like he is getting an ijazah, a diploma to teach Islamic studies, but he still doesn't really feel like he fully understands what he is learning. Then the Indonesian Revolution happens, and Nasution gets wrapped up in diplomatic movements, eventually interrupting his education, becoming a kind of, a pretty high-ranking diplomat. And he is then in the late 1950s invited by Smith, who has heard of him through the grapevine, to attend McGill, where he gets his master's degree and his PhD. And in his recollections about this period, he credits McGill as the place that he truly found Islam. And here is a quote from that. He wrote, "At McGill, I realized that Islamic instruction within and outside Islam were quite different. The lectures had dialogue. All courses were in seminar format. I genuinely felt the benefits. I not only received the lessons, but was engaged in understanding them. There, for the first time, I understood Islam viewed from its various aspects." So just want to highlight a couple things about this. So first, if we think Harun Nasution, a guy who attended a modernized Islamic high school in West Sumatra, studied in Mecca for a short period of time, and then moved to Cairo to study at Cairo, especially at Al-Azhar, credits the McGill Institute of all places as the place that he found Islam. A rather surprising place to credit that type of discovery. Second, to think, well, what did he actually find at McGill? What does he define finding Islam as? And I won't go into the depths of this, but he really spent a lot of time thinking about the Mutazilite school of rational theology while at McGill, Muhammad Abdu's work, and also studying with some of McGill's historians and thinking very kind of historically and also philologically about Islam. So then I want to think about what Nasution does when he returns to Indonesia in the late 1960s. I think he returns in 1969 to be exact. So he comes back to Indonesia. He takes up a job at the State Islamic University of Jakarta. And he remains really excited about the methods and the insights, and especially Mutazilism, that he picked up while at McGill. And he is appointed as the rector of the State Islamic Institute of Jakarta in 1973 by his fellow McGill alumnus, Mukti Ali, who is then Minister of Religious Affairs. And Harun Asution oversees a major curriculum reform across the State Islamic Institute system. Of course, particularly has an impact on the Jakarta campus, but this is a curriculum reform movement that expands across the archipelago. And it has really two important elements behind it. So first, Nasution wrote a textbook that is actually titled Islam Viewed from Its Various Aspects. So that very last line of the quote about his time at McGill. And this 2-volume textbook takes a pretty interesting historical view on the Islamic tradition. So he walks students, introductory students who would be reading this textbook, through what he sees as the historical diversity of the Islamic tradition. He explains in various chapters on theology, on politics, on law, the many different schools of theology, politics, and laws within the Islamic tradition. So to give an example, in this chapter on politics, he talks about the Sunni approach, the kind of dominant Sunni approach after Muhammad's death for how to choose his successor, the Shia approach, the Kharijite approach. And then he says that these are all equally Islamic approaches to how to choose Muhammad's successor, to how to choose a legitimate head of Islamic State. And that the Muslim students reading the textbook then have the right to choose any of those historical manifestations of Islam that they would choose, that they think best fit with their own time periods, their own beliefs. He does the same thing with theology. So he explains the Mutazilite view, the Sharite view. He says, look, these are both equally Islamic viewpoints. You can choose which one fits best into your worldview. Therefore, kind of empowering students to choose the aspects of the Islamic tradition that really kind of resonate most with them. This textbook, then, that he writes becomes the basis for another major aspect of his reforms of the State Islamic Institute system, which is the creation of an introductory level class required not just on the Jakarta campus, but across the State Islamic Institute system, that is basically an introduction to Islam course. So instead of letting students go straight into their Dawah major or their education major or their fiqh major, he requires that all students spend one semester in this broad introduction to Islam with the aim of giving them a more holistic, as he calls it, view on the faith. So he writes this textbook, then the textbook conveniently for him becomes the book that basically every single incoming State Islamic Institute system across the entire system student will have to read in their first semester on campus. He also then is credited with establishing the first graduate program at the Jakarta campus after he steps down as rector, and really building up the master's and PhD programs that would develop across the system, and continually kind of bringing his McGill style perspective on what good graduate training will look like to those programs. Okay, so if that's a little bit of background on Harun Asution, I want to think briefly as my last part of this case study of Nasution's most fierce critic during the time period. Another, interestingly, McGill alumnus, Mohammed Rashidi. So Rashidi also spent a bit of time as a diplomat. He was also Indonesia's first Minister of Religious Affairs, but only served for about 6 months before cabinet shuffles left him out of a job at that time period. And after this time in politics and as a diplomat, he ends up getting his PhD in Islamic studies. Some people credit him as the first Indonesian with a PhD in Orientalism or Islamic studies from the Sorbonne in Paris. Smith during a visit to Indonesia, hears that there is an Indonesian with a PhD from France, gets excited about recruiting him to McGill, brings him to McGill as a lecturer in 1958, where he spends 5 years teaching. So he overlaps with Harun Nasution's time there towards the end. Despite knowing Harun Nasution, despite being both McGill alumna, Rashidi emerges in the 1970s as Nasution's pretty consistent critic of both his own scholarship and his reforms at the State Islamic Institute system. He actually writes a 150-page book that is entitled A Correction to Dr. Harun Nasution's Textbook on Islam Viewed from Its Various Aspects. So this is a chapter-by-chapter critique of Nasution's textbook that he releases to the public. And in the final pages of that, he summarizes a lot of his complaints about Nasution, which I can go into in more depth later if you would like, with these lines. He writes, Dr. Harun Nasution's textbook demonstrates that there are now among us those who have been influenced by Western Orientalists to such an extent that he considers Islam to be one social element that must assimilate itself with Islamic civilization, or Western civilization, sorry. With that, our Islamic identity will be lost along with the scriptural strength that we garner from the Quran. So in a lot of ways, Rashidi was most frustrated with what he saw as Harun Nasution's attack on a unified conception of Islamic truth. So if we think back to the way that Nasution's textbook says, here's one school of theology, here's another, they're all equally Islamic, choose among which resonates most with you. Rashidi found this to be a really disturbing attack at Islamic unity, and also a way that Rashidi thought of it as kind of a creeping type of secularism that in Rashidi's view argued that Islam can adapt to the student reading the textbook rather than the student reading the textbook having to adapt themselves to Islam. And that this basically sidelined Islam to the kind of prominent daily modernizing concerns of Indonesian students and Indonesian Muslims more generally. And he really thought that this was a symptom of the fact that Nasution had been trained in a secular style Western university. So thinking about this as a kind of a major critic of Nasution, who is arguing that this Western educational background that Nasution has picked up is essentially corrupting and secularizing Islam and potentially tainting the next generation of students along with him. So even though this book is published, well, both books, the textbook and Rashidi's work, are published in the 1970s, of course, I want to just note that there are, of course, modern ramifications and repeats of this same type of argument, even though my book ends in 1998 with the fall of Suharto. So in 2005, and you can find even more recent examples of this as well, we get this book that is published that accuses the State Islamic Institute system as being a hotbed for apostasy, and it actually brings back some of the Rashidi lines, etc., and his lines of argumentation against Nasution, replays them again in the next generation. So I would suggest that we have this kind of cycle of arguments. We have these Western educated reformers who come in really excited about the possibilities of Western methodologies, and then you have critics who are going to continually make similar arguments that these are, pseudo neo-imperial efforts to contaminate Islam, that they're not authentic to the Islamic tradition, that they represent threats to a more kind of pure Islamic sense of education. Okay. So I'll wrap up and leave time for some questions. So I just want to leave with two concluding thoughts. So first, this project exposes the extent to which so-called academic outsiders have become entangled, whether wittingly or unwittingly, in insider projects of Islamic reform. Countless academic publications have been read, translated, and selectively appropriated by Muslim intellectuals who then deploy those works in service of their own religio-political agendas. Mohammed Natsir's use of H.E.R. Gibb exemplifies this first form of participation. Some prominent professors, like Wilfred Cantwell Smith at McGill, went further and recruited promising Muslim intellectuals to study Islam at Western universities, and then served as their teachers and mentors. Others regularly consulted on Islam-related policies for Western governments and development organizations, including Smith. Many more used their authority as Western academics to endorse certain visions of Islamic reform and to critique others. Ultimately, Western academics have rarely, if ever, been neutral observers of modern Islamic thought. We are instead active participants in American, European foreign policy, and in Muslim movements to reform Islam. These activities blur the distinction between academic outsiders and Muslim insiders to the point of nearly erasing it altogether. Second, for me, this project raises some troubling questions about the long-term impacts of Western academic cosmopolitanism and diversity. On the one hand, we might celebrate Gibb and Smith because, as privileged scholars, they reached out across national, racial, and religious lines to collaborate with Muslim colleagues. Smith, in particular, opened McGill to marginalized Muslims. This was 1950s, after all, that he was recruiting Muslims from across the Islamic world, and helped them to find a scholarly voice in the Western university. Thanks largely to Smith's efforts, the McGill Institute was and remains one of the most diverse centers for Islamic studies in North America. These scholars undoubtedly helped to create a more religiously diverse and cosmopolitan field. But on the other hand, Indonesian Muslim critics have long castigated these transnational networks as yet another manifestation of Western imperial soft power. Dissidents like Rashidi argue that Western academics pose a threat to the integrity of modern Islamic thought in Indonesia because they wield their power to mold how Muslim students think about and practice Islam. It is, to some extent, a persuasive critique that forces us to reconsider certain academic values. Is the mission to globalize the Western university merely another form of academic encroachment on other ways of knowing and living in the world? How do we balance the principle of diversity with its seeming underbelly, in this case, intellectual imperialism? In the end, my research seeks to foreground these important questions, but I'm very much still searching for my own answers to them. So I will stop there. Okay.
Thank you so much for running us through these highlights of your book, and for introducing us to these key figures and their internal debates. In the book, this atmosphere of the McGill lab also really comes alive with those weekly, now even daily tea meetings and everything. So yeah, it really comes alive. And it's fascinating to hear how these debates then were translated back in Indonesia. I also loved hearing about these categories and the way you unpack them. Opposing the Westerner versus the Muslim, despite obvious overlaps even at the time. So it's quite interesting.
Thanks.
I do have a couple of questions of my own, but I don't want to use my position here too much. So everyone else who has questions, raise your hands, either virtual or real, or just open your mic and ask, or send me the questions in the Zoom, in the chat. Otherwise, I'll use the opportunity and ask just a small empirical question first. Megan, how important was the EIEN for Suharto? When Nasution, when they returned in '69, you describe how they found an education system that was struggling financially, and that they had to build fences and construct dormitories. And so I was wondering how important was the EIN, and how was the funding, in relation to, I don't know, other endeavors? That would be just the first empirical one, and then I see there's already a hand up for the next question. Should we just take the next one too, Megan?
Sure. That works for me.
Yep. Yeah, Professor Claudia Deris, do you want to just ask your question? Or
okay, then I jump in. I didn't want to have a privilege here. Thanks so much, Dr. Abbas, for this sharing your study with us. I've been working quite a lot on another gang at McGill, if you will, not to such an extent though. Fazlur Rahman and Naguib Al-Attas and those guys. Would you have come across the, let's say, transnational relations in a positive or negative way, competition, contestation between Indonesian scholars at McGill and those from the neighboring country, from Malaysia, such as Naguib Al-Attas, and also those coming from yet another sphere, Fazlur Rahman. And what's your take on them? I'm utterly curious. Thank you.
Yeah, so let me take that question and then I'll flip back to the Suharto one as well. So I've actually done a ton of research on Fazlur Rahman. I find him a fascinating figure both at McGill and then in Chicago. So for him in particular, he ends up at Chicago in the beginning in the 1970s. He will become Nurhalis Majid Amin Rice's, not official for Amin Rice, but a secondary advisor, and Ahmed Shafi Marif's doctoral advisor. So when he is at McGill 15 years earlier, he does not have any Indonesian students at that time period, but he does co-overlap with Muhammad Rashidi. And according to some of the interviews I did, they had a kind of slightly tense relationship, maybe not from Rahman's side, but Rashidi felt often, at least according to some of the people I interviewed, overshadowed by Rahman. Rahman was seen as kind of the rising star in the McGill program and the really kind of success case from non-Muslim academics at the time. I have letters going back between H.R. Gibb and Smith that are really patronizing and interesting in their way of saying, oh, he's like the smartest Muslim we've seen for, a generation since Muhammad Iqbal, and, let's push his career. And I think that kind of might have tainted the way that he interacted with other people, especially other Muslim faculty members while he was at McGill. I have no idea how Rahman himself saw himself, because he obviously didn't write that way. That would be really odd about himself. But yeah, he definitely had this kind of star attached to him. Naguib Al-Attas actually left McGill rather dissatisfied with it, was my understanding, in a similar way that Ismail Al-Faruqi was at McGill during this time period as well, and actually had some time overlap and started developing concepts of Islamicization of knowledge. I think the very kind of early thoughts of it, partly from their experience at McGill, that they saw McGill as an attempt to academicize Islam, and they wanted to reverse the process and go the other way. So yeah, it's interesting. I definitely think that McGill has been, to some extent, as I mentioned, successful, or at least fulfilled the vision of Smith as being this midwife of the Islamic Reformation, but not in a predictable way. That some scholars came in and loved what they found at McGill, and others, like Naguib Al-Attas and Ismail Al-Faruqi, and Rashidi had a much more strained relationship. But that strain and that kind of friction produced their own kind of intellectual movements out of it in interesting ways. I can flip back to the Suharto question quickly. Okay, so to switch locations entirely now.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. Which was very hard to structure the book, because the book also switches locations a lot. So I think I would begin to answer the question of how important the State Islamic Institute system was for Suharto by first thinking about how important the Ministry of Religion was in the 1970s. So Suharto, as I'm sure most of us know, refused to let Masumi reconstitute itself when he came to power, and then also quickly tried to politically sideline NU. In the late 60s, early 70s. And that is actually what that kind of double sidelining the two existing political movements is why he turned to Mukti Ali as the new Minister of Religious Affairs in 1971 when he appointed him, as this less involved, less powerful in either of the two major Islamic political movements, and also as a figure who in a lot of ways had a very similar background as the kind of economic technocrats that Suharto was majorly relying on at the time. So if we think about his attempt to kind of sideline the two major political movements and then raise this kind of development-friendly technocrat to the head of the Ministry of Religious Affairs. And then Mukti Ali is the one who appoints her Nasution to reform the system and basically de-NUize it, even though that never really happens, but at least at the leadership level is the kind of vision. And I think that we can see that really for Suharto as a way of trying to spread a development-friendly way of approaching Islam at the State Islamic Institute system, to get people who are not going to come out and protest against family planning, not going to protest against economic development policies of other sorts, and to really quiet the both former Masumi and NU dissidents to the regime, more the former than the latter, and to raise up these kind of pro-development folks. So he gave speeches on and off about how important the State Islamic Institute system was for producing that kind of creative minority that was going to really kind of fuel Indonesian development, and also fuel support for Pancasila instead of any kind of anti-Pancasila movements.
Yeah, understood.
Yeah.
Great, thank you.
Yeah.
Mutmaina, I saw your hand up. Would you like to comment or ask your question?
Thank you very much. Just have a simple question for Professor Megan. In your book, you say that the category of academic outsider and Islamic insiders is called as a fusionist, those who can become a bridge and blur the boundaries between those two. So I was wondering whether fusionist is also the same with neo-modernist Islam. Is there any similarity, or is there any distinctive category, and why not using a neo-modernist? Like you also talk about Nurhalis Majid in your book. So yeah, is there any category, special categories, is the same or it's not the same? And the second one, actually, I know you are the time period of your book is during New World Order, but I cannot resist myself to ask about the contemporary Indonesia, especially after you know, this the importance of this fusionist thinkers, Cendekiawan Islam, that could bridge the insiders and outsiders. And I thought it's really urgently needed, since the conservative term and the conservatism's debate are really you know, dominated the contemporary. Do you think the decay of fusionist or intellectual Islam is one of the reasons why the conservatism's discourses is like really covering all the whole debate recently?
Yeah, great questions. Yeah. So the first question about terminology. Yeah, so I think to a large extent, neo-modernism, I would argue, is a type of fusionism. They absolutely overlap the the two terms. When we think it's also the personalities, Nurhalis Majid, a key figure. Yeah, that this idea of returning to the Islamic source texts, interpreting them with new methodologies, often kind of academic style hermeneutics, really kind of deep critical, you know, attention to historical context, very kind of similar concepts. I think that what I think is helpful about the term fusionism for me is it expands a little bit beyond people who are only the kind of classical neo-modernists in the Indonesian context, because it enables me to think about maybe even Natsir kind of as a fusionist in some ways, because he is so interested in this slightly ironic manner, as I mentioned, in Western academic definitions of Islam. But he's interested in Western academic definitions of Islam that are really bounded, like almost kind of a pseudo clash of civilizations type of definition. But he too is borrowing from Western academics and really using them to kind of shape his Islamic vision. So I absolutely think that there's tons of overlap, but I think that it's not just liberal, or what we might think of now as liberal or modernists who are doing fusionism. It's a little bit wider than that. And that's how I would actually partly answer the second question as well, about the contemporary period and are we seeing a decay of fusionism? So I would think to some extent, yes, because you absolutely see a reactivation of kind of Middle East centric in transnational educational linkages. They never died out, of course, during the Suharto period, but there's more of them, there's more financing involved, etc. But at the same time, I think it's interesting, and I haven't fully thought through this since the book ends in 1998, but I think there's something interesting that some of the most outspoken, maybe folks who are in the conservative turn also have Western PhDs. So I think about Dean Shamsuddin, Amin Rice as well, that they're positioning themselves largely on the conservative side of the conservative turn, kind of the symptoms of Muhammadiyah's shift over, and yet have very similar credentials. And to me, that raises this question of that fusionism, or this kind of entanglement between Western academic studies of Islam and modern Islamic thought, as I mentioned earlier, is not always predictable the way it's going to come out. That yes, some of these individuals are very progressive, development friendly, pro Panchasila, but some of them go to the West and come back, like Rashidi or Amin Rice or Dean Shamsuddin, like really not so sure that that's where things should be heading. So in some ways, even though the United States in particular, US government funds these programs as kind of a mechanism of building friendly networks, of soft power dissemination, it often has unexpected results in the process as well. So I'd be curious what you make of that. Is that overreading Amin Rice, Dean Shamsuddin's educational background? And other individuals, those are the two that really come to mind who might be kind of seen as conservative, as that matters that they have that training, or is it really a decay of fusionism? I wonder. Yeah.
Well, he is food for another conversation. Not surprising that time won't be enough. It's we've already at an hour, but there's another hand up, and we started a little later, so I hope you'll forgive me that I'll ask for a few more minutes. Ana Asrali Muslisin, do you want to ask your question? Open your mic or write it in the? Yeah, great.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much, Professor Abbas, for your very thought-provoking discussions.
Thanks.
So I am from Indonesia, but now I'm studying in Canada, but not at McGill. I'm studying in different place, studying in University of Toronto.
Oh, great.
So yeah, thank you so much for bringing this question. So my question, continuing your statement before that, let's say Dean Shamsuddin come back to conservative. I just wonder what is the reason, in your opinion, why he, after finishing his study in Western and then come back to as conservative Muslim? It is my first question. And my second question is regarding the rules of some Muslim organizations in Indonesia. So we have like Nahdlatul Ulama, Muhammadiyah, and some Salafi organizations. So according to you, how these Muslim organizations respond to or receive Western scholarship? Which one is more welcoming to Western ideas and which one is not? So that's all. Okay, thank you so much.
Yeah,
Again.
Thank you for those questions. Megan, you'll forgive me if I add another one, just I'll use the opportunity looking at the time. And also going back in time in terms of your book, in chapter 3, where you discuss the rise of the Muslim bureaucrats, I kept wondering, where are the Kiai during this period? You know, where are they? What are they doing? Is there a whole class of sort of actual intellectuals, Islamic scholars who live in an entirely separate world from the bureaucrats? How did they relate to each other?
Yeah, excellent questions. Okay, so in 2 minutes, let me see how I can take these. So the first question, why Dean Shamsuddin or other individuals might come back from Western academic universities and make a conservative turn, I think it is an excellent question. And I think is complicated, of course, by individuals' personalities, their pre-views when they arrive at Western universities, their kind of experiences there. But I have a couple of thoughts. So one is, I think that the experience that people have at Western universities personally and intellectually can turn them against the Western University as well. So I think about Rashidi in particular. He has this really kind of nasty run-in with Joseph Schacht, the scholar of Islamic law, while he's at McGill, who basically says, like, you don't know enough about Muhammad to make the type of comments that he was. And if you're Muhammad Rashidi, that is incredibly insulting, and, you know, for anyone, and feels that he is being silenced and almost attacked as someone who holds the religious views he does that are not kind of critical in kind of this source critical manner. So I think that as much as, you know, McGill tries to be this cosmopolitan place, it isn't, as no place is ideally. And there can be a lot of friction and a feeling of alienation that emerges out of the Western University experience. Amin Rice talks about that a little bit, that he felt that he was never at home at Chicago and that he never really fit in. So I think part of it is a personal feeling of alienation that comes from a larger cultural and intellectual. I also think that when we think about Amin Rice and Dean Shamsuddin, they also are able to use the fact that they spent a lot of time in a Western university to heighten the authority of their critique. So they'll often be like, yo, I was there. I've been there. I saw it. It is not what you think it is. It is not worth its time. Go to Egypt instead, you know, etc. So I think that it actually gives them an interesting platform to critique because they've been there. They have an experience that they can draw on to critique. The other two questions, I will very, very quickly and not do either of them justice. So which organizations are more receptive? I think that NU has become much more receptive since like the 1980s and on to Western academic training. I think, of course, Gastor is kind of leading that movement, the kind of emergence of neo-modernism among NU. But I think that Muhammadiyah has a kind of a complicated relationship, you know, even from its very, very starts as an organization that was committed to a modernized, slightly westernized version of Islamic education, but don't go too far. There's like a line of how far can you go in modernizing education. You can see that in Muhammadiyah's most early schools, elementary, middle schools, and then you can still see it today at the academic side, is that we'd want to be modern. We want to be, you know, technocratic, the ability to kind of speak the language of the social sciences, but we don't want to go to such an extent that we compromise certain principles in the process. And the Kiai question, where are the Kiai, might partly be because I just didn't really yeah, that might be just an oversight in a lot of ways in the book. I would completely admit that. But I also think that it's in the 80s and 90s that we start seeing the NU folks really taking advantage of these transnational networks. Earlier on in the 60s and 70s, when the McGill networks are just starting to flourish, you see very few NU folks getting excited or getting nominated also into these. I think that's also, you can think about the gatekeepers. It's, Mukti Ali, who as Minister of Religion in some ways is like choosing who's going to go, and is picking the people that he thinks, should go and that he wants to work with as they come back. And I think as we have more and more Indonesians who are taking these transnational to the West, to Canada, to the United States routes, it becomes more acceptable to some degree, and more opportunities open up and more people from kind of Pesantren backgrounds are able to go. I also think that there's obviously the language problem and the early stages in the 60s and 70s of who was prepared to do that type of study. Yeah.
Great. Thank you. So, since you answered these two questions so efficiently, will you allow me to ask the audience if there's any last question? If there isn't, will you forgive me if I ask another one and just pick up the title of the overall series again and ask for democracy. In the chapter on the modernization theorists, I was wondering if you could just tell us a little bit more about the ways in which the modernists viewed the concept of democracy, and perhaps more concretely whether they imagined democracy in any way beyond liberal democracy, or if it was more of an exercise to see which elements of Islam fit or can be massaged into fitting with liberal notions of democracy.
Yeah.
How creative was the minority?
Yeah, really interesting question. So, so I think I have a couple different ways of thinking about that question, but the first that comes to mind is, to me, there's a real tension in Nurholis Majid, Mukti Ali, Harun Nasution, these folks that in some ways now we look back on as thinking about really like liberal individuals, that they were rather okay with cooperating with Suharto. Like some of them really, really outwardly okay, in the sense of Mukti Ali being his Minister of Religious Affairs. Harun Nasution implemented and supported a lot of the crackdowns on campus activism that Suharto oversaw. So to me, I'm actually writing an article trying to think through this right now, because you have a tradition of thinking, this kind of liberal modernist thinking that is absolutely invested in making an argument that Islam is compatible with democracy, that it's compatible with liberal values, it's compatible with religious pluralism. And I absolutely think that they are genuine in making those types of arguments, and are really, really committed to them. And yet they also are willing to work very closely with Suharto during this time period. And of course, one might say, like, what other choice did they have? Like, Suharto was the only game in town. So, they had to work with him. But I think that the high levelness of the willing to cooperate, that you're not just working at a university, but you're willing to be Suharto's religious voice as Mukti Ali, is not just kind of making do with it, but also kind of being willing to cooperate at a high level. And to me, I think part of that is about the priorities that a lot of these modernists had in the 1970s. That yes, democracy is the ultimate goal, a pluralist, Islam-inspired democratic system that is going to put in Islamic economic kind of redistributive values, Islamic kind of ethics, but is not going to be heavy-handed as they saw it in Sharia. So in some ways, I think a pretty classic, slightly Christian-inspired liberal democracy from the West, but an Islamic tainted one is, I think, what they saw. But they saw the bigger threat, not Suharto's authoritarianism, but the kind of pro-Sharia Masumi crew and the overly traditionalist NU crew. So if they had this vision of this kind of modern, democratic, pluralist Islam, I think that they were willing to trade out the democratic part of that vision in order to achieve the pluralist, liberal parts of the vision. In that time period, in the name of kind of combating the greater threat as they saw it, which was Masumi and NU's dominance, intellectual dominance, which, is an interesting choice. And, I didn't live during that time period, so I'm not going to judge. But yeah, to think that democracy was absolutely central to the vision, but it was also to some extent negotiable for them in contrast to certain other values.
Fascinating how democratic were the Democrats, how liberal were the liberals.
Yeah.
So yeah, I look forward to seeing the article once you're done with that. But for now, thank you very much for sharing all this encompassing summary of your book. Congratulations again. And let's see where the book will travel, and then what archives will open and what we'll read in the next one.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you
So much.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us and for your questions and comments.
Thank you. Yes.